The first time Darren Kowalski climbed into the back of a decommissioned Firewood delivery van and pulled a sleeping bag over his shoulders. It was the middle of October. The year was 2003, and the temperature outside had already dropped to just above freezing. The van smelled like sawdust and old engine oil. The metal walls were bare. The floor was plywood left over from a previous owner who had used the cargo space to haul landscaping equipment. There was no insulation, no heater, no curtains on the small rectangular windows near the roof. Just Darren, his sleeping bag, a wool blanket he had owned since college, and the particular kind of silence that settles over a man when he realizes he has no other option. He had parked on a residential street in Bellingham, Washington, 1 block east of a coffee shop he liked, 2 blocks from the lumber yard, where he worked 6 days a week, loading and stacking timber from 5 in the morning until early afternoon. But outside, the van looked exactly like what it was. A battered white panel van with rust along the wheel wells and a dent in the rear door that had never been fixed. His co-workers at the yard knew he was living in it. His foreman, a thick-shouldered man named Gerald Haas, who had worked in lumber his entire adult life, had found out by accident one Monday morning when he arrived early and noticed Darren climbing out the back, still in his work clothes, folding a sleeping bag with the careful efficiency of someone who had been doing it every morning for weeks. Gerald had stared at him for a long moment, then shaken his head and walked into the building without saying a word. But the look on his face said everything. That look would become familiar over the next few months. The mixture of pity and confusion that people get when they encounter something they cannot quite categorize. Darren was not homeless in the way that word usually lands. He had a job, a steady one. He showed up on time, worked hard, had a bank account, and a phone and clean clothes. What he did not have was anywhere near enough money to rent an apartment in a city where rents had been climbing for 3 years, and where the gap between what a single working man earned at a lumber yard and what a landlord wanted for even the most modest one-bedroom had grown into something that felt less like a gap and more like a canyon. He was 31 years old, and he had made a decision. Not a desperate one, though it looked desperate from the outside. A calculated one. The kind of decision that takes longer to explain than most people are willing to listen. So most of the time, Darren did not explain it. He just got up early, folded his sleeping bag, and went to work. What almost no one understood in those first weeks was that Darren had not simply given up and collapsed into the cheapest available shelter. He had looked at his situation the way an engineer looks at a broken system, not with despair, but with the specific, calm attention of someone who intends to fix it. He had a van. He had access to building materials through his job. He had $200 saved beyond his immediate expenses. And he had something that most people dismissed the moment they pictured a man sleeping in a cargo van: a plan. That plan would take him through one of the coldest winters on record in northwestern Washington and leave him sleeping warmer than most of his neighbors inside their insulated houses. It would cost him under $400 in total. And when his co-workers finally understood what he had actually built inside that van, several of them stopped laughing and started asking questions. But that was later. In October, the laughing had barely begun. The first person who made it a point to say something was a man named Craig Billings, who worked the same shift at the yard and had made it his personal project to narrate Darren's situation as loudly as possible during morning breaks. Craig was the kind of man who needed an audience more than he needed to be right, and the lumberyard gave him one in the form of 6 other workers who found the idea of van living genuinely baffling and therefore funny. The jokes were not clever. They rarely are. but they were consistent. Craig called Darren the park ranger. He asked him every Monday whether he had remembered to crack the windows so he did not suffocate on his own breath. He told anyone who would listen that Darren was one bad rainstorm away from becoming a boat. The others laughed in that uncomfortable way that means they are not entirely sure whether something is funny or sad, and laughing feels safer than figuring out which. Darren listened. He did not respond to most of it. He had learned early in life that defending yourself to people who have already made up their minds is a form of energy expenditure with no possible return. And he was in a phase of his life where every unit of energy had a destination. He ate his lunch. He went back to stacking timber. And in the evenings, after work, he drove to the library, where he sat at a computer terminal for 2 hours every day and read about something that most people have never considered seriously: the thermal properties of different insulation materials, the way heat moves through metal, and the specific engineering challenge of keeping a human body warm inside a steel box. What Darren had noticed in his first 2 weeks was something anyone who has slept in an uninsulated metal enclosure will recognize immediately. Metal does not hold heat. It actively conducts it in whichever direction the temperature gradient wants to go, which in October in Washington means straight from inside the van into the cold night air outside. He had woken up on his 3rd morning with frost on the inside of the metal walls. Not on the windows, on the walls themselves. The moisture from his own breathing had condensed against the bare steel and frozen there. The sleeping bag and wool blanket combination had kept him alive technically. But alive is a low bar, and Darren had always had the particular stubbornness of someone who refuses to accept low bars as fixed ceilings. He spent 3 weeks researching before he bought a single thing. The library computer gave him access to forums where other people had done what he was doing, or something like it. Some had chosen mobile living as a lifestyle, others out of necessity, and their documentation of what worked and what failed was detailed enough to be useful. He read about vapor barriers and thermal bridging and the difference between fiberglass bats and closed-cell spray foam. He read about the specific problem of condensation inside metal vehicles, which cannot be solved the same way as condensation inside a wood frame building. He read about R values and started doing the math on his van's surface area versus the insulating capacity of materials he could realistically afford. Darren had gone 2 years toward an engineering degree before running out of money and deferring indefinitely, which was a polite word for what had actually happened. But the thinking habits had stayed. The way of breaking a problem into its component parts and addressing each one in the correct order. That had not gone anywhere. The first thing he needed was a vapor barrier. Condensation was the enemy that would defeat him before cold ever had the chance, building up moisture inside his walls until the insulation saturated and lost its ability to function. He bought a roll of polyethylene sheeting from the hardware store for $11, cut it into panels, and taped it to the bare metal walls before installing anything else. Every seam overlapped. Every edge was sealed. It was tedious work in a cramped space, lying on his side with a utility knife and a roll of foil tape, pressing plastic against cold metal in the dark of an October evening. But it was the foundation. Without it, everything that came after would eventually fail. The insulation came next. He could not afford spray foam, which would have been ideal for a curved metal surface. Instead, he bought rigid foam board, the kind that comes in large pink or gray panels, which was cheaper and could be cut with a utility knife and straight edge. He spent 2 evenings measuring every surface inside the cargo area: the walls, the ceiling, the floor, the wheel wells, the areas around the door frames. He drew it all out on paper at the library and bought exactly the number of panels he calculated, plus one extra for mistakes. The total cost came to $112. Installing it was a puzzle. The interior of a panel van curves at the top where walls meet the ceiling. It angles around the wheel wells. It has structural steel ribs running vertically every 18 inches that the foam panels had to fit between or be cut around. Darren worked on it every evening for a week, cutting panels to shape and securing them with construction adhesive. The ribs were a thermal bridging problem he already knew from his reading. Metal conducts heat, and those structural ribs were essentially heat highways connecting outside to inside, regardless of what he put between them. He solved it by cutting thin strips of foam and pressing them directly against each rib before installing the main panels, which broke the thermal bridge without any structural modification. What he ended up with, after that week of evenings in a parking lot with a utility knife and a pile of foam, was a cargo area that looked identical from the outside. From the inside, it looked like someone had lined a van with a patchwork of gray and pink foam board. It was not beautiful, but it did not need to be. He tested it that Friday night in mid-November, when the temperature in Bellingham dropped to 28 degrees. He climbed in around 9 in the evening, zipped his sleeping bag, pulled the wool blanket, pulled the over the top, and waited. He had a small thermometer he had bought at the outdoor supply store, the kind hikers use, which he hung from a bungee cord attached to a rib near the ceiling. When he had climbed in, it read 31 degrees inside the van. The foam had not yet had time to make a difference. He fell asleep before he could check it again. In the morning, the outside temperature had dropped to 22. He reached for the thermometer before he had even fully opened his eyes. It read 47 degrees inside, 25 degrees warmer than outside, with no heat source at all. Just insulation, his own body heat, and the thermal mass of the enclosed space holding on to what he generated through the night. He lay there for a moment with the thermometer in his hand and felt something that he had not felt in a while. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something quieter than that. The particular stillness of a person who has correctly solved a problem and now has to decide what to solve next. The next problem was that 47 degrees was still cold enough to make mornings genuinely unpleasant. He had been thinking about a heating solution for weeks, balancing cost against complexity, against safety, because heating inside an enclosed space involves risks that insulation does not. Carbon monoxide, fire, moisture from combustion byproducts. He had read enough to know that people had been killed by inadequate ventilation while sleeping in small heated spaces. He was not going to be one of them. The solution he landed on was a small diesel heater, the kind used widely in trucking for cab heating and in marine applications. These units burned cleanly, exhausted outside through a small fitting, drew combustion air from outside as well, and consumed very small amounts of fuel. The one he found was a reconditioned unit, bought secondhand from a truck parts supplier in Tacoma for $85. It came with hardware, but no instructions, which was either a problem or not, depending on whether you were willing to spend an evening with a wiring diagram and some patience. Darren was willing, installing it on a Saturday. The exhaust outlet went through the floor toward the rear, angled to keep water from entering. The combustion air intake came through the same floor section, sealed with high-temperature silicone. The fuel line ran from a small secondary tank he mounted under the van, separate from the main supply. He ran the wiring to a secondary battery he had installed to avoid drawing down the starter battery while parked. Total cost for the heating system, including the secondary battery, and all hardware came to $160. He tested it that same Saturday evening. The temperature outside was 34 degrees. He turned the heater on at its lowest setting and sat in the cargo area reading a library book, watching the thermometer. Within 15 minutes, it read 62 degrees. Within 30, it was 68. Turned it down. The smallest possible output from the heater in the insulated space was more than he needed on a night that cold. He made a note to get a temperature controller before winter fully arrived. Now here is what I want to ask you something, because I think about this a lot. Darren had been in that van for almost 2 months at this point. He had spent his evenings at the library. He had spent his weekends doing careful, methodical work with simple materials and second-hand equipment. He had not complained. He had not explained himself. He had not asked anyone for help or advice or sympathy. And what he had built was, by any engineering measure, genuinely impressive for the budget and the constraints he was working under. So here's the question. If you had been in Darren's position, if you were 31 years old, working a physical job 6 days a week, sleeping in a van, being laughed at by coworkers every morning, and you had a plan that you were quietly executing, would you have said anything? Would you have tried to explain what you were building? Or would you have just kept working? Leave your answer in the comments, because I am genuinely curious what you would have done, and I suspect the answers are going to be more honest than people usually are in public. By December, the van had become something that even Darren had not fully anticipated. He had built it to solve a heating problem. What he had actually built was something closer to a small, mobile, extremely efficient dwelling unit. The insulation kept the heat in so effectively that the diesel heater rarely needed to run more than an hour at a time, even on the coldest nights. His monthly fuel cost for heating came to approximately $15. He was cooking on a single-burner propane camp stove he set near the open side door when he used it, which solved the ventilation question for cooking as simply as possible. He had a water container and a small basin for washing. He had a crate that doubled as a table and a step. He had a reading light wired to the secondary battery that gave him enough light to read or write by every evening. The total space was small, about 60 square feet of usable cargo area, but it was warm, dry, functional, and cost him nothing in rent. His total monthly expenses had dropped sharply. Rent plus utilities in Bellingham for the kind of apartment available to him on his income had been running over $1,200 a month. In the van, his shelter-related costs were fuel for the heater, propane for cooking, a gym membership for showering, and occasional car washes. Total, under $60 a month for everything that had previously cost more than 12 times that. Gerald Haas noticed the change before anyone else, not in how Darren looked, but in how he carried himself. There is a particular weight that financial stress puts on a person, a low-level constant tension that expresses itself in small ways. The way someone holds their jaw, the speed at which they eat lunch, whether they linger after a shift or leave immediately because time is always slightly insufficient. Gerald had seen it in enough workers to recognize when it lifted. He noticed it lifting from Darren somewhere around February of 2004, and one morning in the break room he asked, straight and without preamble, "You doing all right in that van?" Darren looked at him. "Better than all right," he said. "I am warmer than I was in my last apartment." Gerald raised an eyebrow. "Van's insulated?" "Properly," Darren said. "Foam board on every surface. Diesel heater with outside exhaust. Secondary battery. Sleeping in the high 50s even when it is 15 degrees out." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, more to himself than to Darren, That is smarter than most people I know. That conversation changed the temperature of the break room in a way the diesel heater never could have. Because Gerald Haas was not a man who said things he did not mean, and everybody at the lumberyard knew it. When the foreman says something is smart, it becomes interesting in a way it was not before. Craig Billings stopped making the park ranger joke around that time. Not immediately. Men like Craig do not stop immediately. But gradually, over the following weeks, the jokes became less frequent, and then stopped entirely, replaced by something that was not quite respect, but was at least a form of silence that left room for a different conversation. The different conversation started happening in early March, when a young man named Tyler Marsh, who had started at the yard in January and was paying $1,500 a month for a room in a shared house with 4 other people, began asking Darren real questions. Practical ones. What kind of foam did you use? How did you handle the condensation? What does the diesel heater actually cost to run? Darren answered all of them without drama. He was not performing anything. He was not trying to convince anyone of a philosophy. He was just describing a system he had built and how it worked. Tyler went away and thought about it for a week. Then he came back and asked if Darren would walk him through what he had done. So one Saturday morning, Darren opened the rear doors and showed him the interior. Tyler stood there with the same expression Gerald had worn in February. Not awe. Something more precise than that. The recognition of a solution that was simpler and more effective than he had assumed. They stood in the parking lot for almost an hour. Tyler took notes on his phone. He asked about the vapor barrier, the wheel wells, the thermal bridging, the specific brand of foam. He asked about the diesel heater and the secondary battery and the carbon monoxide detector, which Darren described as non-negotiable. He asked about the exhaust fitting in the floor and why the combustion air intake and the exhaust outlet had to be on the same side of the van, which had to do with pressure dynamics and the risk of exhaust being drawn back in during certain wind conditions. Tyler built his own version 3 months later in a cargo van he bought for $3,000. He made some different choices, using spray foam where he could afford it, and where irregular surfaces made foam board difficult to fit. But the fundamental design was the same as Darren's, and when he slept in it for the first time on a night in late June, when the temperature dropped unexpectedly to 40 degrees, the interior stayed at 64 without the heater running at all. He texted Darren that morning, 64 inside, 40 outside. You were not kidding. Darren texted back one word. Correct. There is something I want to pause on here because it matters to the story. Darren was not living in the van because he was lost. He was not in crisis in the way that word usually implies. He was someone who had done the arithmetic of his situation and arrived at a conclusion that most people around him would have found uncomfortable to consider. He had looked at what he earned, what things cost, and what he actually needed. And he had made a choice that the people around him had not made, not because it was unavailable to them, but because it required stepping outside assumptions so deeply embedded in daily life that most people never notice they are operating inside them. The assumption that shelter means a fixed address. The assumption that cold is an inevitability rather than an engineering problem. The assumption that the way things are done is the way things must be done. What Darren found when he questioned them was that many of them were not load-bearing. They could be removed without the structure collapsing. What remained was a simpler and more honest version of the problem. You need warmth. You need dryness. You need a place to sleep and a place to exist in the hours between work and sleep. How you provide those things is engineering. The rest is preference, and preference is expensive. If you have ever had a moment in your life when things got suddenly harder than they had been, when the financial math stopped working the way it used to, and the options started narrowing in ways that felt personal, even though they were not, you know something of what those months felt like from the inside. Not the cold specifically, not the van specifically, but the particular experience of being in a situation that people around you don't understand and have strong opinions about anyway. That feeling of being entirely alone inside a decision that is yours to carry. If any of that resonates, consider subscribing. Not because this channel has answers to that feeling, but because the stories collected here are full of people who carried exactly that weight and found their way through it. And sometimes it helps to know you are not the first person to have carried it. By the autumn of 2004, Darren had been in the van for just over a year. His savings had grown to a level that 1 year earlier he would have described as impossible on his income. He had done nothing exceptional to get there. He had simply stopped spending $1,200 a month on an apartment and redirected that money somewhere it could grow. He had also, somewhere in that year, stopped thinking of the van as a temporary situation to be endured and started thinking of it as the thing it actually was, a very small, very efficient, very deliberately designed home. He bought a foam mattress pad cut to the exact shape of the cargo floor. He built a simple platform from scrap lumber he brought home from the yard, which raised the sleeping surface and created storage underneath. He added a small shelf along one wall that held his books, his toiletries, the temperature controller, and a photograph of his parents taken at their kitchen table in Iowa, which was the only decoration in the space. These were not luxuries. They were refinements. The difference between a system that works and a system that works well. Gerald Haas stopped him in the parking lot one September morning. He said, "You have any interest in doing this for other people?" Darren looked at him. "Doing what?" Gerald gestured toward the van. "The insulation work. I know 3 long-haul drivers. They sleep in their cabs during layovers. All of them complain about the cold. If you could do to a cab what you did to that van, I think they would pay you." Darren had not considered this. He thought about it for a moment, running the practical questions through in the order they needed to be run. He said, "How much layover time do they have?" Gerald said he thought usually 2 days at the Bellingham terminal between routes. Darren nodded. Then he said, "I could do it in a day if they help with the panel cutting." "What would you charge?" Gerald asked. Darren thought for a moment, then named a number. Gerald said that was probably too low and named a number slightly higher. Darren said all right. He did the first cab that October. The driver, a man named Paul, who had been running freight routes between Bellingham and Portland for 8 years, watched him work with the focused attention of someone who had been uncomfortable for a long time. Darren worked from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. He lined the cab's sleeping berth with foam board, installed the vapor barrier first, cut around every irregular surface, sealed every edge. He added a small diesel heater similar to his own, ran the exhaust through the cab's roof vent hardware with a fabricated adapter, and wired everything to the truck's auxiliary power system through a disconnect that kept it from drawing down the main batteries. Paul slept in it that night, parked in the terminal lot, in 41-degree weather. He texted Gerald the next morning. Gerald called Darren and read him the text. It said, 59 inside when I woke up. I have not slept that warm in a cab in 8 years. Darren did 2 more cabs before the end of the year and 4 the following spring. Word moved through the terminal, the way useful information always moves through communities of people who share a practical problem, which is fast and without ceremony. Someone slept warm. Someone else wanted to know how. The how was available, and it worked. That was sufficient. He was not running a business exactly. Not yet. He was doing work for people who needed it, and accepting payment in return. But it was money coming in from a skill he had developed to solve his own problem. And there is something clarifying about that moment in a person's life when the thing you figured out for yourself becomes the thing other people will pay you to provide. It changes how you understand the problem. It changes how you understand yourself. The winter of 2005 was the coldest on record in northwestern Washington in almost 2 decades. January brought temperatures that the older residents of Bellingham talked about with the particular reverence that people reserve for weather that genuinely surprised them. Nights below 20, ice on roads that the city was not equipped to handle, wind off the water that made the low 20s feel like single digits. The local news ran segments about heating assistance programs and the importance of checking on elderly neighbors. There were reports of pipes freezing in homes that had never had that problem before. Heating bills doubled for people who used electric systems. Hardware stores sold out of space heaters. In the lumberyard parking lot, Darren Kowalski climbed out of the back of his van on the coldest morning of that January. The morning the thermometer in Bellingham reached 11 degrees, and the temperature inside his cargo area had been 63 when he woke up. He had run the heater for about 40 minutes during the night, triggered by the temperature controller when the interior dropped below its set point. He had used perhaps a quarter gallon of diesel. He folded his sleeping bag. The same one from 2003, though, showing its age now, stacked his blankets and put the kettle on the camp stove, with the side door cracked 2 inches for ventilation, the same way he always did in the morning. Craig Billings pulled into the lot a few minutes later, got out of his car, and walked toward the building hunched against the cold, his breath making clouds in the 11-degree air. He stopped when he saw Darren standing calmly by the side of the van, both hands around a mug, steam rising in the still, cold morning. Craig looked at him for a moment. His car had not warmed up on the drive over. His house had cost him more to heat in January than in any previous January he could remember. He said, without preamble or irony, the way a man asks a question when he genuinely wants the answer and has run out of reasons to pretend he does not. "How warm does it get in there?" Ben looked at him. He said, "Last night it was 11 outside. I woke up to 63 inside." Craig was quiet for a moment. He looked at the van. He looked at Darren. Then he said, "You ever think about doing that for someone else's vehicle?" Darren said, "I already have." Craig said, "How much would you charge?" And there it was, the full turn of the wheel. The man who had spent months calling Darren the park ranger, who had made the joke about cracking the windows so he would not suffocate on his own breath, who had performed the comfortable person's version of contempt for a situation he had not taken the time to understand, was standing in an 11-degree parking lot, asking seriously and sincerely for the practical knowledge that the person he had mocked had spent 2 years developing. Darren did not make a speech about it. He did not say, "I told you so," which was available to him and which many people would have said. He gave Craig the same information he had given Tyler, the same information he had given Paul and the other drivers. He told him what materials to use and where to buy them and in what order to install them. He told him about the vapor barrier and why it had to come first. He told him about the diesel heater and the secondary battery and the carbon monoxide detector that was not optional under any circumstances. He told him what it had cost him in total, and he told him what it would save him every month if he chose to use it. Craig listened. He nodded. He asked a few questions that were practical and reasonable. Then he said, "Thank you," in the plain way of a man who means it and has nothing more to add. He went inside. Darren finished his coffee in the cold morning air, rinsed the mug in the small basin in the van, and walked into the building to start his shift. By 2006, Darren had moved out of the van. Not because anything had gone wrong with it, but because the savings he had accumulated had reached a number that changed his options. He had enough for a down payment on a small house north of town, a modest place that needed work, but was structurally sound, with a workshop attached to the garage he had plans for. He still drove the van. He kept it insulated and functional. He slept in it on long drives and weekends when he was doing installation work too far from home to make the return trip worth it. He did not think of the move from van to house as a graduation. He thought of it as a change in operational parameters. The work he had started doing for the truck drivers expanded over the following years into something recognizable as a small business, though Darren would have resisted that word longer than most. He was doing thermal insulation and heating system installation for commercial vehicles, recreational vehicles, and work vans, and eventually, through a connection made at the lumber yard for a company that built cold storage trailers. He hired 2 people, then 3. By 2010, he had a proper workshop and a waiting list that stretched several weeks out. He had not set out to build a company. He had set out to be warm. The company was what happened when a solution is real enough and useful enough that the people who need it find you eventually, regardless of whether you have advertised or positioned yourself or done any of the things business books say are necessary to be found. He had just solved the problem correctly, and correct solutions tend to outlast the skepticism of everyone who thought they were foolish and become, over time, simply obvious. Tyler Marsh still lives in a van. Not the first one, which he sold in 2007, but the third, which he has been in since 2012, and which is more finely engineered than anything Darren built in that parking lot in 2003. Because Tyler has had more time and the benefit of standing on the foundation Darren laid. He still works physical jobs, still saves at a rate that people in conventional housing find difficult to believe, and still answers questions from people who want to know how he does it, with the same straightforward patience Darren showed him in a parking lot a long time ago. Gerald Haas retired in 2009. At his retirement lunch in the break room, he gave a short speech that nobody had asked him to give. He said he had worked with a lot of people over the years, and most he would describe as competent, a few as skilled, and maybe 1 or 2 as genuinely smart. Smart, he said, does not mean educated. It does not mean credentialed. It means seeing a problem clearly and solving it with what you have. He looked at Darren, sitting near the wall with a paper plate. He said, "The smartest person I ever worked with slept in a van for 2 years and was warmer than most of you." He picked up his coffee. "That is all I have to say." Craig Billings built a version of the van insulation system into a utility trailer he converted for camping. He used it for 7 years. He told Darren once, around 2008, that he was sorry for the park ranger thing. Darren said it was fine. Craig said he did not think it was entirely fine, and he was sorry anyway. Darren said, "You came around. That is what matters. There is something in this story that goes beyond insulation and diesel heaters. There is something in it about the particular courage it takes to do the careful, unglamorous work of solving your own problem when everyone around you has decided it cannot. be solved, or should not be solved the way you are solving it. Darren did not have a dramatic moment of defiance. He did not make a speech or draw a line in the sand. He bought foam board at a hardware store and spent his evenings cutting it into panels in a cold parking lot. He did this patiently, without an audience, without encouragement, without any guarantee that it would work. He just understood the principles and trusted the math and did the work. And when January delivered 11 degrees and cleared out the easy certainties of everyone who had been comfortable enough to have strong opinions about how other people should live, the math proved correct. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. Just quietly, in the way that things built correctly tend to prove themselves, by continuing to work while the things built incorrectly stop working. To the people who stayed until the end of this story, thank you. That means something. Stories like this one take a while to tell properly, and the people who follow them to the end are usually the ones who understand why they matter. If something in Darren's story landed for you, whether it is the stubbornness, the careful thinking, the patience with people who do not understand what you are building, or just the simple image of a man waking up warm in an 11-degree parking lot with coffee in his hand, hold on to that. These stories are here because practical wisdom is worth preserving, and the people who figured things out through necessity and patience deserve to have their thinking remembered. There is another story waiting for you on this channel. Same kind of material. A person, a problem, a solution that the people around them could not see until it was already working. When you are ready, it is there.